Hi, this is Noel Paul Stuckey, sometimes of Peter, Paul, and Mary, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Every February, the modernist architectural world descends on Palm Springs, California. It's an 11-day architecture and design festival called Modernism Week. And this year, as always, U.S. Modernist Radio is there, interviewing nearly all of Modernism Week's keynote speakers, plus special guests. It all happened at the U.S. Modernist Compound, a.k.a. Poolside, at the hip Hotel Skylark. Today, we're talking to Vishaan Chakrabarti on how forward-thinking urban design can change the world, Missy Wood of FORMUS on the potential of virtual and extended reality to change the building process, and Sharon Prince on how her organization, Grace Farms, works to foster peace and reduce suffering around the world. Later on, a few minutes with architect and architectural humorist Jody Brown. One thing that struck me a few years back during my first visit to Modernism Week was the fact that great modernist design isn't just architecture. It's also what's inside, the furniture, the art, the pure aesthetic of modernist interiors. It's what Mies van der Rohe termed less is more, and you get to see many examples of great modernist interiors with us at Modernism Week.
I'm so proud of you, Tom, quoting Mies van der Rohe. You've come a long way.
Once I learned how to pronounce him, then I started reading what he had to say. We bring you inside some of these amazing homes with their clean lines and their remarkable furnishings. So if you've ever wondered what Frank Sinatra's kitchen and bedrooms look like, come grab a martini and join us next time we go. And now the martini master himself, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Hey, thanks, Tom. In Palm Springs, as many places you could go in California, there's one particular pilgrimage you want to make sure you go to, and that's the In-N-Out Burger. The closest one is on the edge of town, and the line forms there at 10 a.m. pretty much, and doesn't let up all day. If you can get your car onto the parking lot to even get into the drive-through lane, you can consider yourself lucky. It is a cult phenomenon of burgers. It's been going on for a long, long time. And they're not on the East Coast yet, although every year I know a bunch of states are trying to get them to expand. So make sure you stop by and get an In-N-Out Burger. And as a tip, there's a secret menu of In-N-Out Burger options that you can find on the internet. Want to go with me and Tom to Modernism Week in February 2024 and stay with us at the U.S. Modernist Compound? Email me at george@usmodernist.org. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Vishaan Chakrabarti is the founder and creative director of Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, where he leads the firm's growing global portfolio of cultural, institutional, and public projects. He has served as the dean of the UC Berkeley College of Environmental Design and as a professor at Columbia University.
Go Lions!
His latest book is A Country of Cities, a manifesto for an urban America. Vishaan believes that well-designed cities have the capacity to address some of our gravest social ills, including environmental degradation and decreased social mobility. Here's George's conversation with Vishaan Chakrabarti, poolside at the Hotel Skylark.
Vishaan, it's been 10 years since your book, A Country of Cities, came out, which was a real breakout piece for you, wasn't it?
It was, and I had never anticipated writing a book. It was actually Rosalie Ginevra at the Architectural League of New York who had encouraged me. I had been writing a blog called A Country of Cities for a little website that's under the league called Urban Omnibus, which is still around and is not a little website anymore. And Rosalie really encouraged me to turn it into a book, and I'm very glad I did. Because, in some ways, I'm not sure it was saying that much that was new, but it was the way I think the information was synthesized, and it struck at a certain moment that I think sets up the moment we're in now in a certain way. Because, I've had this lifelong interest in the relationship between architecture and cities. And even when that book came out, not that many people spoke about cities, but people now are understanding more and more the relationship between cities and climate change, between cities and social inequity, and a lot of the other big issues that we talk about today. And now, and I'm sure we can get into this after the pandemic, what cities mean, and especially not just big cities, but smaller cities all around the world. And now I'm working on a second book, so that is actually in some ways a response to the first book.
To the first book. Well, let's start with who's got this. What city is the best example of getting their act together in America?
In America, so I get this question all the time, and I don't think there's any one city that is doing everything right.
Or mostly right. Let's just say mostly.
So, and again, I just want to make sure we're being specific. Yeah. This is in the post-pandemic circumstance, right?
Yeah.
So, we're seeing a lot of small cities around the country pick up a lot of population growth that's coming out of the big expensive cities. Every day you read an article about how people are leaving San Francisco or leaving New York or even Massachusetts. I'm in something called the Mayor's Institute for City Design, which is a program from the National Endowment for the Arts. Mm-hmm. Boise, Idaho has a lot going on right now.
It's huge out there.
Yeah. And,
exploding in Boise.
But, there's a bunch of very smart mayors who are understanding these trends, realizing they have to build more urban housing, dense multifamily housing, more bike lanes, more forms of mass transit that aren't subways like New York City or LA, but, are streetcars or bus rapid transit, that if they're going to attract today's youth, that they need to be something other than kind of the old suburban car-dependent model. So I do think there's a bunch of small cities that are doing a lot of things well. I think New York has actually got really good leadership right now. I was on this thing called the New New York panel, which the mayor and the governor appointed 55 of us to think about the city post-pandemic and how it continued to attract the best and the brightest. And I do think we're doing a bunch of things fairly well. The transit system's getting back up on its feet, and we're talking about building 800,000 new units of housing in New York State in the next 10 years to make it more affordable. And so every city is doing things and experimenting with ideas. The thing you can't do is rest on your laurels right now. The cities are going to lose population if they think that people will just pay the old prices and do the old things. That's just not what's happening anymore.
Yeah. And on the other end of the spectrum, I guess there's Houston, right, which is just a mess.
Well, Houston's a mess. I mean, Houston was always the punching bag for city planners because it didn't have zoning and all of that. Houston has a very good planning chief named Margaret Wallace Brown. She's brilliant. My friend Michael Kimmelman wrote an amazing article about a homeless policy in Houston and how they've taken 25,000 people off the streets. And that is a really interesting dynamic that's happening because arguably they're doing better with their homelessness crisis than certainly San Francisco is and better than New York is by getting people into permanent housing. And so this is what I mean.
You wouldn't think of that for Texas.
You wouldn't. But look, Texas cities are fascinating. I'm actually going to Texas right after being in Palm Springs. San Antonio, Austin, Houston, Dallas, each of them are, first of all, we live in a kind of dynamic now where even in the deepest of red states, you've got Democratic mayors.
Yeah.
That's true in most places around the country, not everywhere, but most places around the country. So you still have a bunch of activist mayors who are out there trying to do things with homeless policy or parks or bikes or whatever it is. And that's really good to see. It's really, really good to see. And so you started with my book. The book was called A Country of Cities. And it was about, hey, let's think about this thing that is our economic engine where most people live in the United States, our urban regions. And I really do think that there is this new kind of impetus to do great things in our cities. We won the competition to expand the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, and I recently met the new mayor of Cleveland, who's this very dynamic young man who is really trying to bring population back to Cleveland. So I see it all over the country, George, where I see cities really doing some smart things.
Vishaan, you had a special role post 9/11. What was that job?
That was a job I never thought I'd get or never thought I was qualified for. I still don't think I was qualified for it. I was working as an architect at Skidmore, Ellington, Merrill. I was an associate partner. I'd gotten licensed. I was doing work I was really interested in. The big project I had been running which was the new headquarters for the New York Stock Exchange, went into construction documents September 10th, 2001. And so obviously 9/11 happened the next day. That project came to a screeching halt, as did many projects around the city. And SOM actually played an interesting role right after 9/11 because a number of the buildings around the World Trade Center site were designed by SOM legacy buildings.
Oh, really?
And so there was a lot of coordination with police and fire departments and so forth. And, Mayor Bloomberg was a candidate at that point. And there was suddenly this moment where, it's interesting. It's always a lesson for me, George, because today we talk about big issues in our cities like gentrification. Back then, no one was talking about gentrification in New York City. People were worried about whether the city would survive.
Yeah.
And I got this call to interview with the woman who'd become my boss and is now still a very close friend, Amanda Burden, who is the chair of the City Planning Commission, and Deputy Mayor Dan Doctoroff to become planning director for Manhattan.
And this was during the Giuliani administration?
No. This was after. So Mike Bloomberg won, and it was a couple months after that.
All right.
And so it was in the Bloomberg administration. It was the very early days of the Bloomberg administration. And I got the job, and I'll tell you, I was utterly shocked. I did feel wildly underqualified. The person who had the job previous to me was about 2 decades older than me and had a lot of experience doing that kind of work. But they wanted fresh ideas, and they wanted. It's interesting. It's a hot topic right now in Palm Springs. Amanda was very concerned about the design of the city, not just buildings, but public spaces. And, how could design be an economic engine to help bring the city back? Prior to 9/11 in New York City, there'd become this kind of adage that form followed finance.
Yeah,
right.
I heard that, yes.
And that it was just a developer town doing developer buildings. And that's what it was. I mean, we were doing pretty mediocre stuff. And then all of a sudden 9/11 broke through and there was the competition at the rebuilding of the World Trade Center site. But then there was also a whole bunch I was very involved with the High Line and the buildings around the High Line. And again, this was before the gentrification arguments, which later really ensued around the High Line and other places in New York City, and we can talk about that. But there was this great moment for design. I got to be on the design selection committee for both the architect and the landscape architect for the High Line, and we designed the zoning mechanism that helped save the High Line. And so, these were heady times. I mean, we were fighting to keep the streets integrated through the World Trade Center site, and Columbia University was expanding, and all sorts of things. I worked for the city for about 4.5 years. It was one of the greatest experiences of my life.
And what great connections, too, towards the different departments in the city and the different players in the city, and they're all scrambling to try to reassess themselves in wake of 9/11.
So I have a kind of strange educational background. I studied art and engineering undergrad, and then I studied city planning, and then I got an architecture degree out here in Berkeley, actually. And I'm one of these people who came to architecture a bit late. And part of why I came to it late is whereas I always loved it, I wasn't sure of its societal relevance to the big issues of our day.
Yeah.
And what that experience working for the city proved to me that design can really matter. And it can really matter to people and their livelihoods and the things that are near and dear to their hearts. And, my next book is very much about this argument about why architecture matters to the big pressing issues of our day. And so that job for me was a kind of inflection point in my career and my life in terms of teaching me the value of this weave between architecture and urbanism. And that's why my practice is called POW, Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, because that's what I got gleaned out of that job, is that there's this weave between the two disciplines that's, basically become my life's work.
In the 60s, when there was the public housing boom all across the country, architects kind of heralded themselves as the great saviors. They were going to solve all the social injustices through these magnificent design buildings. And yet the government didn't provide any funding post-construction for creating actual community in those buildings to make them sustainable and have the residents want to take care of them. So has that frontier changed at all? Has the government changed its position about when they build public housing, when they maintain it?
Well, remember, since something called the Faircloth Amendment in the late 1990s, it's illegal for the government to build public housing. The federal government can't build public housing.
Really? I did not know that.
So this started under Reagan, and it kind of came to its culmination under Bill Clinton. There's an excellent documentary I'd recommend to anyone interested in this called The Pruitt-Igoe Myth.
Oh, I've seen that, yeah.
It's great documentary,
Yeah.
right? Made by a former resident. And, the truth is that the Yamasaki buildings, which sort of became a punching bag for both the right and the left. The right used it to say, look, you put things in the hands of government, they'll screw it up. The left was like, well, it's warehousing the poor and these big modern buildings and like, well, what a disaster they are. Neither storyline is really true. The storyline is actually much closer to what you just said, which is there's money to build the buildings, but not to maintain the buildings. The St. Louis Housing Authority did horrible things with Pruitt-Igoe.
Yeah.
And there are similar stories around, under Reagan, remember, we forget in our divided times that in 1984, Reagan won every state but Minnesota.
Really?
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah,
he
yeah,
won
he did.
every single state except Walter Mondale's home state. He won Massachusetts. He won California. There were no blue states and red states in 1984. And on the heels of that, he passed the tax reform of 1986, which basically gave us the affordable housing system we have today, which is developers who get low-interest financing from the government to go build affordable housing.
Okay.
We're involved in one of those projects. There's good things about them. They are much more mixed income than this notion of like all people of one income in a housing project. They tend to work on very, very tight budgets, so it's very hard to squeeze any architecture out of them. But the thing that you're talking about is how do you build community, which is different than building a building.
Right.
Right?
Is there a store? Is there a school? Is
Yeah.
there daycare? Is there anything?
If you're interested, on my website, there's a project we've been working on for 5 years now. First buildings are being designed right now because I had to go through entitlements that we're designing for a Reverend A.R. Bernard out in one of the poorest, blackest parts of New York City. And
Where is that?
East New York. It's
Okay.
near Kennedy Airport. It's out in eastern Brooklyn, Flatlands Avenue. Great community. I've spent a lot of time there. And it's 2,000 units of affordable housing in 11 buildings, a 300-seat performing arts center. But then the ground floor is filled not just with things like grocery stores and fresh food, but also vocational training, workforce training, 24/7 daycare, which was very important to the Reverend, and public space.
Yeah.
And so we are building community, not just housing as widgets.
Yeah.
And you need a great client, and the Reverend is a great client. And so, but that is being built on that tax credit system we talked about earlier. There is virtually no government-funded social housing in this country, unlike Vienna, which has one of the best public housing systems in the world, or other parts of the world that you can point to where there's very successful forms of social housing.
So it's all at the state level now, I guess.
It's at the state. Yeah, but even then, the state doesn't hire me as an architect to go design and build buildings.
Okay.
So what happens is it's all contracted out to developers.
Okay,
who
so
then
it's
go
all
out and build.
privatized,
It's all
essentially.
privatized on the basis that, I think one of Reagan's great victories was not just convincing the right, but really convincing all of America that government's inept,
Yeah.
right? And so if you want anything done right, it has to be done by the private sector. And I think we're starting to come out of that moment because the private sector can't build mass transit. The private sector can't do a lot of things. Look, I own a 30-person architecture firm. That's the private sector. I have no problem with the private sector. But you need a functioning government. And you need to not just believe government's inept. And, that was when I worked for the Bloomberg administration. We had a very, very competent, thoughtful public government. And I think that is a really important thing to aspire to as a society because we can't just do it all through the private sector or through individual action. It's something that is talked about a lot in my first book. I talk about a lot in my second book as well, that we need to get over this mindset that anything the government does is somehow corrupt or inept.
I agree. Well, let's talk about something fun.
Okay.
Magnetic levitation. I understand you're a fan.
I am a fan. I'm a fan. Look, the Shinkansen, Japanese high-speed rail, it's hard to imagine. It was built the year I was born in 1965. I spent a lot of time in East Asia as a graduate student, kind of on shoestring and bubblegum in terms of budget, but still, I'm just a huge fan of rail, and rail can connect us in a way that has manifold benefits for the climate, for society, and it just astonishes me that we don't have a real high-speed rail system in this country. Maglev, there are over 30 flights a day from New York City to Philadelphia, which I would tell you is just sheer madness.
Yeah.
I mean, that's nuts, right? And the trains are kind of packed to capacity, and they're still not as fast as they could be. And, actually, it's interesting. If you look at the Biden infrastructure package and the announcements he made recently, both in Baltimore and then again in New York City, they're about improving the rail infrastructure in the Northeast Corridor. Everyone's watching what happens in California with bated breath about high-speed rail. I'm very worried about it because the first phase doesn't connect major population centers.
Oh, yeah. I read numerous articles about the fact that this wonky California high-speed rail line kind of goes all over the place based on local politics. And
Yeah, there's a lot of that. But there's also the fact that they kind of seem to have made the decision that connecting San Francisco and LA in a first phase was going to be very difficult because of the rights-of-way near the major cities. So it sort of feels like it goes from a fruit stand to a farm. So what I worry about is that it's a setup for failure because rail and any form of mass transit needs population density to make it work. That's where the passengers come from. Right. And so, I just really worry that you're going to see a lot of empty train cars and everyone's going to point to it and say, see, it doesn't work. But that's because we didn't plan it the right way, and so in some ways I wish they had started with San Diego to LA. It's just something shorter something that they could have chewed off, right, that would have connected at least some of the Southern California destinations. But there's constant talk about what's called the Texas Triangle and connecting the big Texas cities with high-speed rail. Now, how would that be? Wouldn't that be an irony if our first high-speed rail system in the United States were in Texas? But hope springs eternal. You never know.
And you were pitching one for the Great Lakes area?
Yeah. I mean, look, I was just talking about the fact that we're designing the expansion of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. This wasn't by design, but most of our work is in the Great Lakes region right now. We're doing this wonderful memorial and heritage trail up in Niagara Falls, which was one of the northernmost destinations for the Underground Railroad. We're doing this expansion of Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. We're doing this work around Michigan Central Station for Ford in Detroit. And I refuse to call it the Rust Belt. I don't think it's the Rust Belt. There's a lot of innovation and people who know how to build things, and it's actually an extraordinary part of the country. Mm-hmm. And it just amazes me how much flights cost and how long they take to get relatively short distances. And, that if you could do that in a maglev from New York and Philly to Pittsburgh and then over to Cleveland and the Great Lakes, you could connect a lot of people, a lot of employment centers. I mean, I say things like this. People say, oh, you're crazy. You know how crazy it was to build the Erie Canal?
Right. And that was 1800s?
Yeah.
Right?
And if it weren't for the Erie Canal, we wouldn't have had the industrial Midwest.
Right.
And so we used to have this determination and aspiration to build these big things, the Hoover Dam, the Tennessee Valley Authority. It's extraordinary the infrastructure this country once built.
Well, that was back when we were more entrepreneurial. Now we're just cranky.
It was also that we believed in government.
Yeah.
We actually believed FDR could do these things. And that's, to me, that is, like I said, the big victory of the Reagan era. To kind of say, nah, we can't build that stuff anymore. We're just going to let it go to a bunch of private hands and they'll take care of it. And I mean, the pandemic proved, look, Big Pharma came up with our vaccines, which is great.
Yeah.
But we needed a very functioning government to accelerate the production of those vaccines, to distribute them, and so it's not a binary thing. You need both a functioning and public and private sector. You see it all over East Asia, where you see a thriving kind of collaboration between government and private individuals to get things done. But I just think people have forgotten our own history. We have an extraordinary history in this country of building some of the greatest public infrastructure works that mankind's ever conceived, really since Rome. And yet we don't really celebrate it enough or think about it enough.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with me. It's really a pleasure and honor to meet you.
My pleasure.
I had read through your book that we mentioned. When is your new one coming out, approximately?
It'll be at the end of next year, the end of 2024. It's called The Architecture of Urbanity, Designing for Place, Pluralism, and Planet. It's being published
Very alliterative.
Yeah. I like alliteration. It keeps people awake sometimes.
Yeah.
It is being published by Princeton University Press, which is a great press. And again, it argues very much for architecture, for design, and how that matters to building a more cohesive and climate-conscious world.
Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
That was my conversation with Vishaan Chakrabarti. Missy Wood is the founder and CEO of FORMUS, a virtual reality platform for the design and building community. A graduate of Meredith College,
Oh, hey, go Angels!
she's leading FORMUS to cut costs in the construction process through the power of extended virtual reality. Yep, it involves a headset, and I tried it out in Palm Springs. Pretty cool. Here's my chat with Missy Wood, taped at the Palm Springs Convention Center. Missy, I understand you come out from a technology background,
I do. Over
this-
20 years of experience.
but this is your first podcast.
It is my first
Yay!
podcast. Yes, it is. It's very exciting.
Missy and I have something in common. We both frequented a particular restaurant in Coates, North Carolina, which is very small. How many people in Coates?
2000
Maybe 2,000. It's on the way to soccer games in Fayetteville and Dunn and Lillington and other places. We would have to stop in at Ma's, which was this burger joint.
Yep.
And it had the very best hamburgers and fries, and this hungry soccer team would pile in there with Ma. And Pa was still alive then.
Oh, my goodness. That's amazing.
I think he knocked off shortly after that. Is that still around?
It's not. I think it closed down a couple of years ago.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah.
That was really a great roadside attraction.
It actually was. It's so crazy because it was at the end of my street where I grew up. So
Really?
I passed it every single day.
Every day?
I don't know how many meals I've had there, but that's where I grew up. Yeah.
So tell me about your new business.
Okay, so FORMUS is the name of our business, and we are a technology company creating a software that helps all the stakeholders in the design build sector to collaborate more efficiently with their customers, to help customers understand their decisions, make better decisions of their choices so that it eliminates redesign and cost overrun.
Okay. So that sounds all great, but what is it exactly?
So we're using VR right now as the basis, so customers can collaborate with architects, designers, interior designers to create their space of whether they're building a house or redesigning a house, and they can work with the designers to really understand what they're buying or committing to before they actually start the development, the construction.
So would the architect be the customer for this software?
For us, yes, we would want the architects, the builders, the interior designers to use our software to work with their customers to create these experiences.
So
yes.
let's say an architect has this in their office. Does the client come into the office and strap on a headset, or do they do it from home, or how does that work?
Right now, not everyone has a headset.
Right.
We believe that in the future, everyone's going to have their headset. So
I thought we were going to have an implant.
or that, there might be the implant. But they would be able to just, pull up the app from the headset and collaborate with their designer, architect, whoever they're working with.
Okay.
Or they can go in their office and do it as well. They would just need a headset. We also are developing it because people are pretty resistant to putting on the headset because it's still a fairly new technology. So we're also creating it for web VR. So you can go to a website, and the only difference is that you're not immersed in the space.
Yeah.
So you still can get a good idea and understanding of what you're designing in context of a space, but it's not the immersive. You don't get that spatial awareness that you get with
That's the
VR.
sexy part, really, with the technology,
Yeah,
right?
it just depends on what the customer's looking for. Like if they're looking for this specific dining room table to fit, in this certain space, like to be able to be in a space to get that spatial awareness of how big that table actually feels in this space. You can't do that with a photo or looking online.
No, you really can't. So let's say that I'm the client. I'm in my architect's office. I strap on the headset. And what do I see? Am I sort of in a virtual world where I'm walking around in my house? Or is the architect able to, if I say, Chip, move that wall 3 feet, I can see the wall move? How does this happen?
Yeah, so that's the idea. So imagine you're working with your architect on a new home. You're building a new home, and you have met with them. You said, this is what I want. They have an idea of what you're looking for. They then go and design it in their tools based on what you said that you wanted, and they upload what they use. Like they use, 3D CAD programs or like Revit. These are different programs that they use to create a 3D model of what you're wanting. And so they take that 3D model and they upload it to our program so that it optimizes it for VR. So that space that they are designing is now in VR so that you can immerse yourself, you can put the headset on, and you can walk around and you can see the design that the architect designed for you. And they could also, if you've worked with them and said, well, I'm not sure I want these kind of floors, these kind of cabinets, not sure on the vendor or the color, they can curate different vendors and colors that they think is what you're wanting. If you wanted like a certain tile for backsplash, but you wanted to be able to see that tile before committing to it, you can click through and see the different options for tiles in real time.
Okay. So the architect can create different scenarios that I, as the client, can go, okay, it's like being at the eye doctor. I'll take A or B. Which one
Exactly.
is better, right?
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And so the idea is to involve the customers in the process, to give them just enough transparency and involvement in the process to help educate them, help them understand their choices without giving them full control. I mean, the architects and the designers are still the ones that need to be able to, they're the experts here, and so they need to curate these spaces. They need to be in control of what the customer is seeing based on, what they've asked for. But the customer also needs to have a better understanding of what the designs are and what the architects and interior designers put together. And so that's the reason behind what we're doing, is to help educate these customers in their choices and how it affects the overall project.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
So once people get past any kind of apprehension about VR, do they have like an aha moment? Do they they go
it's amazing.
like, this is incredible?
Yes, because we're set up in the booth right now, and it's a challenge to get them to get the headset on, but then they don't want to take it off.
Yeah.
And they get it. It clicks. They immediately they're like, oh, this is the future of home design. I'm like, yes, it is the future of home design. and so right now, our customers are architects, interior designers, vendors, but eventually we're building this tool for the customers or the homeowners to drive it, because we need this to be a have-to-have and not a nice-to-have right now, because, it's newish technology. So eventually we want it to be where customer says, oh, I'm not building a house unless I see this in VR first.
Right.
Because I want to make sure that I'm not risking having to redesign or having cost overrun. I want to make sure that I know and I understand what I'm getting before I commit to this.
Now, I first saw a product very similar to this 30 years ago. It was in monochrome green, and you walk through at this tiny little pace because the computer chips couldn't keep up with this at all. And it was like playing an old game on a Commodore 64, and you could kind of creep through a house right that. But I assume this is like, 4K color, like really rich, like you're there now, right?
Yes, and so we've worked really hard in the last year researching different 3D modeling companies that can help us create environments and help us learn how we can best create these to give these customers the most realistic experiences, because with the headsets being standalone, the hardware can only go so far. If you get a chance to come check it out, it's possible, and we've created some beautiful spaces that are super realistic, and we actually have put a few of the vendors here at the show into a show home. So when customers come by our booth, they can see these products and click on it and say, oh, that's Tesla tiles, and can go and know where the booth to go to and go to see the tiles in person. They say they see it in our VR, and then they can go see it in person.
So if I am an architect and I have a project, say, in Revit, how long does it take your program to generate this world from the time I press the button to download the file?
So we're still in development.
Yeah.
So there's only so much I can say about that. But right now we are manually doing that, where we have VR developers, but the technology that we're building allows you to load it into our platform, and then we have a marketplace of vendor products. You can pull from those into your home and curate what you want. In a click of a button, you can render for VR to show on a headset. It goes to the application, or you can render it to export to a website to see in web VR. Just do it yourself.
Is this like in the old days there was the Suites catalog that you could pull items out of on paper and sort of compare it to your plan, but now you're actually getting to see it?
Yes.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah. It's amazing.
So one of the things that you're working on as a company is
using this software to help reduce costs for houses. How does that work?
Cost overrun. So most homes experience about 20% cost overrun, and that is from poor project data and miscommunication. Of customers not understanding the decisions they're making, how it affects the overall project.
Yeah.
So say, a customer chooses a certain window for their room and then later says, you know what, I think I want this window instead. They don't realize that it's not just the cost of that window that changes, it's the whole structure of what you've designed now changes. And so there's cost on that. So ultimately, where this platform is going is to help in real time as they're making their decisions and the changes, that they understand how it affects the overall project timeline, costs. So right now, if you think about it in the traditional construction, at what point do people really understand what their final project's going to look like?
Sure.
It's after construction, right?
Right.
That's when it costs the most to change, is when it's already done. What we're doing is we're giving the ability to make those changes at the beginning of the process when it basically costs nothing. To change. Yeah.
Well, the average person really doesn't have a sense of what things cost anyway. Architects tell me all the time that somebody will come in and they'll want a change that they think is like, $2,000 and it's $20,000, or vice versa. They'll think something is very, very expensive that they want, and they won't tell the architect, which could be done for a couple $1,000s. I think it'd be great one day if within your program, when somebody makes a change, this little cash register comes up and says, hi, this is going to cost you $30,000.
Well, that's what we're doing. For example, right now we are marketing to vendors because in order for this to be of value for architects and interior designers, there needs to be a marketplace of products.
Yeah.
So we're marketing to vendors at this point while we build the builder interior design aspect of it. But the vendor will own their piece of it, of making sure that they keep their data updated. So if there's a cost change, if there's a delay, a shortage of a certain item, like they're in charge of keeping their data updated so that if a vendor goes and pulls their product in their space and use that, the customer knows right then and there like what the cost is and kind of the timeline of when it's going to be available. Because, you think about supply chain and how, it fluctuates. And so if a customer is designing their home and I really want this certain faucet, they will see, this faucet is not available for 2 months, so that's going to delay this project. This, it's at all times it's communicating when they make a certain decision, how that decision affects the whole timeline of the project and the costs.
When do you anticipate to have the full launch of your software?
That's a good question.
Is it imminent? Is it a year off? What do you think?
We need a lot of people to be able to build this because there's so many different aspects of it. We're still building our team. So it just really depends on what the next year looks like as far as, the people that we pull on our team to be able to execute this. So we have a very small team right now. We're doing everything ourselves and doing great, but it's a slow process because this is a very small team. So I hope in the next year, next year at this time that we are ready to fully launch at least, the MVP.
What is your website where people can learn more about this?
It's buildwithformus.com.
And FORMUS is spelled?
FORMUS.
Buildwithformus.com. Thank you, Missy, for chatting with me.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this opportunity.
George was talking with Missy Wood of FORMUS. Returning podcast guest Sharon Prince is the CEO and founder of Grace Farms Foundation, whose interdisciplinary humanitarian mission is to pursue peace through nature, the arts, justice, community, and faith. A former business executive, Sharon has shepherded Grace Farms through 10-plus years of growth, including their world-class building designed by SANAA in New Canaan, Connecticut, that serves as the heart of the foundation. In 2020, Grace Farms launched both its Design for Freedom program, devoted to eliminating forced labor in supply chains, and Grace Farms Foods, a public benefit LLC devoted to ethical and sustainable supply chains. Here's our conversation with Grace Farms founder Sharon Prince.
Sharon, thanks for coming back on the show.
Well, it is great to be here right in Palm Springs with you.
You spoke at Modernism Week. What did you speak about?
It's about Grace Farms and architecture as a lever for change.
And you're embarking, or you have embarked,
on what is significant change for the world in the way they think about materials.
Exactly. So being here at Modernism Week is really terrific because of the nature of modernists being not only optimists, but understand the relationship between people and nature, and also considering radical moves, which is what we're doing with Design for Freedom, in terms of not only thinking about materials, but creating a more humane future with how we build. So that's Design for Freedom.
What are the pieces of Design for Freedom?
So we're creating a movement to create a radical paradigm shift to be able to source and procure materials that are free of forced and child labor. So right now, the construction sector is getting a labor transparency pass. And you can sort of think of it like first food is called to be accountable to its supply chain, then clothing, and next will be shelter. So since we last spoke about it, this is almost 2 years ago,
Right.
so much has emerged too. So we started at that point with just really initializing the movement with the report that came out that just contextualized this gap within the industry, and for the industry to start considering how to use their means and methods, the way that we build, how we use the full ecosystem to have that agency, to start to create more transparency within the supply chain. And too, like it's voluminous. So we have thousands of materials that go into the supply chain, unlike food and clothing. So it's a pretty daunting challenge, but it's also remarkable that it hasn't been surfaced. We had the epiphany back in end of 2017. And the time we spoke, we had about 60 leaders of industry at that time. And now we have over 100, including more manufacturers. And we've had many different markers now in the last 2 years to keep and really to accelerate the movement.
So this is a construction supply chain. Building materials?
Yes, building materials. So it's the other half of the equation. So the other half is on-site labor.
Right.
The other half is the material procurement side.
Okay.
What materials are the worst offenders of this?
When we initialized the movement, there was no list. So there's actually 12 materials that include some that you would know, mining and textiles, that go right into our buildings. But steel, concrete, glass, copper, timber, these are materials that go into all of our buildings. And so many also, there's environmental issues that are with most of those extractives. You're also looking at not only embodied carbon, as we're examining materials, now we're asking to add fair labor inputs in that examination, really to examine embodied suffering.
Okay, embodied carbon. Can you explain that to me?
So embodied carbon is the amount of carbon, too, that is needed to, in this case, in terms of material manufacturing or extraction, that is released into the air. So
through the
during
process of
right.
extraction.
The process of extraction. But then embodied carbon is not yet so much as embodied in those materials. So the next step, though, is like there's a lot of work being done in terms of sustainability. The green building movement, the very beginning was 30 years ago or so, even longer. And that was still a daunting task at that point. We're still not there yet, but now we're saying we can't create these sustainable movements or the measurements for sustainable building without considering who's making those materials. Are they made with fair labor?
Well, that's my question. I mean, if you're eliminating steel and timber and all these things, are all those industries made with unfair labor and slave conditions?
Yes. So all these materials that are made with forced labor do find their way into our buildings because there's been no examination. There's no inspection of those materials for fair labor. There's no accountability.
So is this the entire steel industry, for instance?
So no, all these materials have a portion are made in hot spots around the world. And
like where? Where are these coming from?
We put together a toolkit. You can look online, and there's, for every one of those materials, we did a deep dive that showed the hot spots around the world, that there's been evidence of human rights violations. And we also illustrate those relevant certifications that have also been used for sustainable purposes, for LEED certifications and for sustainable practices that are now adding fair labor third-party audits or considerations.
So where are these coming from? Can you name the countries or the regions?
Yes, there's many. So one that is very relevant right now is solar panels. We're thinking about creating our just transition energy-wise for the built environment. And we're all very excited maybe about putting solar panels on our buildings. However, polysilicon is one of the primary minerals that is used. And there's also copper and aluminum and glass. However, 45% to 50% of all the polysilicon in the world right now is mined out of the Uyghur region of China. And there's a Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act now in the United States that prohibits any goods made from the Uyghur region from entry into the United States.
Yeah, that's a community of people in China who have been suppressed for a long time.
Yes, and so there's evidence of over 1 million that are in forced labor conditions. So that's why the government in the United States also responded that way. And it's not just China. There almost every country. There's so many can experience it here in the United States too, at a much lower level. And we're not considered a hotspot for most materials.
Thank goodness.
Yes, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So, nevertheless, the solar panels right now, because this law went into effect over the summer, there's 1 to 3 gigawatts of those solar panels sitting at our borders. There's been withholding release orders. So it is disrupting.
That's a lot. Okay.
It is. and it's disrupting the solar industry. We had MIT engineers at Grace Farms a couple years ago, and I would describe this issue before the law came into effect, knowing the hot spot that the Uyghur region is. And one of the engineers, I described how we're also limiting innovation. Not only are we driving costs lower, like we're looking to drive costs lower without inspection, you're raising the risk of human cost. But you're also limiting innovation because there's no R&D dollars going into new viable products if we're subsidizing with forced labor. Like, it's just too cheap. You can also see solar panels, they haven't really developed that much over time. But now, literally this last year, the industry's been put on alert. And now there has been, like, the perovskite cells and organic cells have now been started to be developed again.
So new technology in solar panels that is, I guess, more sustainable or not made under forced labor situations.
Should be an
that's
aspiration.
Innovation.
Yes, that's innovation.
Right.
Exactly. So that's one. But there's also cobalt and linked to that. So you have to create the batteries that are used to store the energy. And we're using the lithium-ion batteries that we don't talk about that, the EV batteries, but in the cars, people understand that's fraught with forced labor. It's coming out of also regions that have evidence of forced and child labor, one being the DRC, and that has...
the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Africa.
In Africa, where there's histories of not only human rights violations, but slavery, that also in colonization that have now... You can see what's happened with the country now. A lot of those resources that they're so rich in are not going back to the people. And that's a whole nother conversation. Yeah. But there's 75% of the world's cobalt is coming out of that region, and cobalt and copper are in the same veins, like they're adjacent to each other in those mines. Copper is used voluminously in the construction sector. About half of it is used, with the copper piping, and now we have these other sustainable solutions that use these minerals. So that's just the sustainable side. But then you look at timber. We're looking at mass timber for our new construction methods. And we use that at Grace Farms. We use structured land beams at Grace Farms. And this is before I had that understanding. But thankfully, they were FSC certified. Doesn't mean that's also 100% clear of forced labor. They just now put in fair labor requirements. So when we built Grace Farms, that wouldn't have been the case. However, you're limiting the amount of exposure when you have more oversight of any operation.
Right. So if somebody comes to you and they want to build a building, where do you tell them to go? Because it seems like you've named every major product that goes in the building
Exactly.
and every country in the world. So how do they navigate this?
Well, the toolkit was part of what people are asking for, just like you're asking, where do I go? People generally want to say, I don't want to use forced labor. I don't want to subsidize my project with forced labor, which is essentially what we're doing when we don't have that verification. So that's why we put together the toolkit. So we have a toolkit that does go through educating on each one of those materials, but also creates a questionnaire for suppliers. You could be the architect, engineer, owner, construction managers. We have Turner on board now that have built one project that helped to start to develop the toolkit. It was one of our initial Design for Freedom pilot projects. And that's super important because not just saying that this is an issue.
Right.
We are at the same time demonstrating what we're advocating for. We need to start putting that into play. And we've done that through these pilot projects. The pilot projects we're taking a slice of the materials. There's too many. It's too onerous, and there's just no way you can create that transparency, but we can start. And so we did that with the new Canaan library that just opened about 2 weeks ago. And Turner was on that project. It was a smaller project for them, but it has like now a cascading effect throughout the entire company. I've been speaking to the ESG summit that they just held. Their commitment is very strong. The U.S. State Department, OBO, oversees business operations where they build around the world. They're committed and spoke at the Harris Truman building about this and confirmed that commitment. So leaders are stepping up. Arup, Burrow Happel, Shop. We have so many within the
What are these
group.
companies?
These are architecture firms.
Okay.
Sorry, yes.
All right.
Architecture firms that are building major projects around the world. And it's important that those leaders are also, they're saying yes before it's all figured out.
Right. Okay.
And that's important because they're not duplicative in our efforts. Right? So now I can say, which is happening. So Shop is holding in 2 weeks a gathering of probably 30 within our working group and others, along with Fair Supply that we introduced them to out of Australia that had created tracing methodology. And so now we're all meeting together in the city this is with competitors. It could be Burr Happel and Arup together as two different engineering firms. And it's exciting to see that because it's a pretty quick uptake to understand the magnitude of the issue when we already do know there's issues that's evident within textiles, like I said, in timber and mining. It's just that hasn't been brought together and made the very opaque supply chain, disaggregated nature of architecture and construction, the whole industry, now start to pull this all together. And that's what we're doing and leading the movement.
Pull away the curtain from the supply chain a little bit.
A lot, hopefully, in the end, right? So what's interesting, too, now, this is different than the green building movement because it's an opt-in with green building. There's less laws. Like there's laws that do exist around the world that apply to forced labor.
It's a voluntary thing for green building. It's voluntary.
Yes, more voluntary, right? But it's actually not voluntary with procuring materials that are made with forced labor and child labor.
When people want to find this toolkit, where do they go?
So it's designforfreedom.org. We have the report on there, the toolkit. We share the pilot projects, including the Serpentine Pavilion. We have a brief that we create out of that project. We're holding an annual summit that is not a conference. It is actually galvanizing leaders and the public who are interested in their agency too to come and join in. And we just held our second summit. The first one was with Prince Zaid Rad Al Hussein, who is the High Commissioner on Human Rights for the UN. And when he came, he said, this is how all good revolutions start. He was astonished. He not thought about it either. And his term ended in 2018. He said, this is how it all begins with people like you that are also willing and eager and curious to know how are we going to address this issue.
Right. The countries or the regions that are using this slave labor, any of those come to you yet and say, hey, we want to get better?
Yes. So our Justice Initiative at Grace Farms, we also work on capacity building with countries actually in Africa. So we do work with Tanzania, and that's exciting too because they understand it's always about leadership within organizations and countries, and that's one that we are working with to work on environmental crime. So the intersection of not only forced labor, but environmental crime, deforestation.
Right. I was going to ask if you are attacking the business of protected and endangered trees being harvested
Absolutely.
illegally.
Yes.
That happens in Eastern Europe. Yeah.
Exactly. So in fact, when we start to initialize the transparency of your supply chain, this happened with one project. We know that Russia, before the war, already has had human rights violations within the forestry industry that without even knowing, if you don't know where your timber is coming from, it's still, even after the war, you could have been sourcing it from Russia within the supply chain. You didn't know it at that time, right as it started. So we were able to switch gears right away with that.
And of course, as more economic sanctions are imposed upon Russia, they're more desperate for cash. And so the likelihood that they're going to find black market ways to sell their resources really increases.
Exactly. So there's now even isotope tracing methodologies that are coming to play. We're bringing, interesting, right? So we had the Oratane at the summit, and that's what they do. They actually can identify the isotopes.
So they're able to use the isotopes that's part of the atoms in the wood it's like a fingerprint, sort of?
So what they're working on now is with Supima cotton that has a premium fiber, which is now they're able to identify the soil that it was grown in. So you know exactly, you can pinpoint where it's coming from.
Wow.
So that's exciting. There's technology that is available. We just need to start to add fair labor inputs to those existing technologies and not create a whole separate lane.
Right. Mm-hmm. Besides Design for Freedom, what can people do when they visit Grace Farms?
So much more since when we last spoke, because we were just opening back up in September 2021. So we've added a lot of new experiences for people, other gateways into the foundation's work. We have a new exhibit that will be opening soon about Design for Freedom that was created by Nina Cook-John. And we have new beauty and logic programs with our music director, which are full house. So we have about 700 in the sanctuary. We have free concerts, other concerts too that are ticketed. So it's a combination. We have a new music director who's a Harvard mathematician and a top saxophone player. And I've known him for many years.
Really?
Yes. He's bringing phenoms like himself, I think, that are within classical music. One was Serene, who came with both a self-taught background as a pianist, can play Rachmaninoff, and just incredible, one, the up and coming, and also as a Google scientist who's created existing platforms that they're still using. So she's really young. And so we have phenoms like that. Then they'll have a conversation around classical music, really expanding the palette of beauty for people to not only understand, but engage. And then jazz musicians and lots of other disciplines helping to bring forward.
The website is gracefarms.org, and it's a place everyone should visit. Thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you again. It's so great to see you.
That was our conversation with Sharon Prince of Grace Farms.
And now a few minutes with architect and architectural humorist Jody Brown.
Day 220. Thomas stood behind me while I drafted on the computer. Try it without the edge detail, he said. I clicked a few commands into the computer. Like this, I said. Thomas squinted at the screen. No, but keep at it, he said, and drifted off towards the coffee maker. Day 221. Thomas went to UPenn in the 70s, which he'll tell you after only a few minutes of conversation. He studied under Louis Kahn. Louis Kahn once told him to discover what the building wants to be, a phrase he now uses frequently. Thomas told me this when I interviewed with him. He showed me images of an award-winning design for a cell tower he had done years ago. The metal grate roof over the office at the base of the tower was designed to break the ice as it fell from the tower. The design was industrial and geometric and cold. Thomas said it was pedantic, a commentary on the state of technology and society. I found myself staring at the ink stain on his right palm. I wasn't really listening. Day 222. Thomas brought pizza today. We ate it at our desk while we worked. Day 223. Today Thomas had us all bring our school projects in and pen them up in the conference room to share. Thomas penned up his own project as well. It was a rest station bathroom, designed as 2 interlocking cubes with pyramidal roof forms. The exterior walls were lifted off the floor so you could see the ankles of the patrons. Thomas said this was a commentary on privacy in society. Thomas uses the word commentary often. My project was discussed briefly. The word derivative was used. Day 224. Thomas called us all into the conference room today. Someone had used a non-standard layer, and the resulting line weight on the plot was displeasing to Thomas. We all sat silently when he asked who did this. Day 225. Thomas says the client will walk through the office this afternoon, so we should clean up our desk. Thomas doesn't want to see anything that might offend the client. We should take our lunches in the cafe area today. Day 226. Thomas took us all downstairs for a drink today. The client liked the latest office plans, and Thomas wanted to celebrate. Mark and I ordered an IPA and sipped them cautiously. Thomas ordered a scotch. Glenlivet, neat. He raised his glass and toasted a job well done. I don't think Thomas ever worked on the office plans. Day 227. Today, my former colleague sent me the images taken of my project for the awards submission at my previous firm. Thomas came over to my desk while I was looking at them. Those trusses should be painted in a contrasting color, he said. I wanted them to be white to make the space cleaner, more open. Thomas said that was one way to go. Mark shot me a knowing glance. Day 228. Mark and I presented the latest designs to the client today. We chose to keep the drawings simple, going with all black and white with strong shadows. We're going for a modern aesthetic, using warm materials like wood as accents. The client liked the design and said we were on the right track. A few changes were discussed, but the overall direction was approved. Later that afternoon, the client called Thomas and said they had reconsidered. They would like something more traditional. I was taken off the job before the end of the day. Day 229. Thomas wasn't here today. He was in Washington, D.C. at a conference. We all worked quietly at our desk all day. It was glorious. Day 230. Mark spent all morning erasing the power lines in Photoshop from the rendered views of the new branch bank design images. Thomas said they distract from the design idea. Day 231. I was working on the door schedules when Thomas asked me to help him draw up his kitchen. His wife had decided to renovate, so I measured his house and drew up the plans. Thomas explained the design idea behind the original house. He wants to honor the original idea in the renovations. I suggested moving the refrigerator to be closer to the sink. Thomas said that would weaken the design intent. Then he asked me to go back to working on the door schedules. Day 232. Thomas studied under Louis Kahn. He once told me that Louis Kahn died in the bathroom stall at Penn Station. Day 233. Did I mention that Thomas doesn't pay me to work here?
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Want to go with us to Modernism Week in February 2024? Just email me at george@usmodernist.org.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to our past shows, discover documentation of 20,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.1 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Kelly Policelli researched over 40 guests for our Modernism Week interviews. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back in 2 weeks with another Drinkin' Martinis edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.